can get anybody to do anything with steady, loving confrontation.
We are discussing 3 books today.
I will read from the second chapter from my novel Death is Hard Work.
I love this book. It's meant a lot to me, and this is terrifying because she's in the room, and I'm a big fan.
A book about don't let the words kill you.
So, Hadley, did you like it as much as Ida?
I loved this book. I so loved it. I couldn't get hold of it where I lived.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session with journalists Simen Ekern from Dagens Næringsliv and Shaun Walker from The Guardian. My name is Teresa Grøtan, and I'm the festival director, and I'm very pleased to welcome these 2 journalists on stage.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event. As Teresa said, it's arranged in cooperation with the newspaper where I work, Dagens Næringsliv. This hour here today, it's called The Spies Among Us. And just before we start, I want to make sure that there are no spies here, or if you could make yourself known, just to avoid any embarrassing... Thank you. So we don't have any misunderstandings. Yeah, okay, excellent. They're the best, I think. I am very pleased to be here with Shaun Walker. He is an international correspondent for The Guardian. As we have seen with recent events with the Washington Post in the United States, having foreign correspondence is unfortunately no longer something that can be taken for granted. But Shaun has, for several years then, been reporting from Moscow. He has covered the war from Kyiv. He lives most of the time, or quite a lot of the time, in Warsaw. And he is the author of several books, amongst which his most recent one is the topic of our conversation today, The Illegals. Russia's most audacious spies and their century-long mission to infiltrate the West. And just to start with the basics, Shaun, an illegal. What is an illegal in this context?
Okay, sure. And hello, everyone, and thanks for coming and thanks for your interest. So, what's an illegal? So, I mean, in the basic terms, most big spy agencies have 2 types of spies. So there's the spies who work under diplomatic cover, so they'll have a cover job in the embassy, they'll be second secretary politics or whatever, but they will actually secretly be an intelligence officer. And obviously the benefit of that is that if you get caught being a spy, you have diplomatic immunity, so you just go home, you get sent home. But then, the bigger intelligence agencies also have a second type of spy, which operates without diplomatic cover. So, for example, the CIA calls these people NOCs, non-official cover. And this could be, an American business person or insurance salesperson, or in the past, they promise they don't do it anymore, a journalist. Skeptical laughter in the room. In the Russian system, you have what the Russians call the legal spies, or the legal operatives, and those are the people who work out of the embassies with diplomatic cover. And then you have the illegals, which is basically anyone else, but the type of illegal that I'm most interested in is this program, which is very different to almost any other country. Because, if the CIA will use the American business person or the American journalist in the past, what the Russians do, the Soviet Union and today Russia, is actually spend years training Russian citizens to be able to pass for foreigners. So in this way, this is the illegal, it's a spy who is sent abroad on a mission that can be a few weeks or it can be decades long, basically a whole lifetime. And the idea is that not only are they disguising their links to the embassy, they're not under diplomatic cover, but they're disguising all of their links to Russia.
And we're going to get into some of the history and some of the stories here. I just wanted to ask you first, because this book, I mean, it's full of extremely fascinating and sometimes incredible stories, but it's also full of stories from people who are still alive. And I wanted to ask you to tell us just a little bit about how you got into this project and how you worked with and researched it. How did you get access to these illegals, for example?
Yeah, so there were like many parts to it. My first interest in the topic came nearly 10 years ago now. It was May 2016, and I met the two sons of a couple of illegals who had been operating for decades. They were posing as Canadians. They lived in Boston, and their two sons were 16 and 20 when the FBI came knocking on the door and arrested their parents as Russian spies, and it sort of brought these two young men's worlds tumbling down. They thought they were kind of from an ordinary Canadian family. So I spoke to them because at the time they were suing the Canadian government to get their citizenship back. They were saying, you know, it's not our fault that our parents were in undercover. And through that, you know, that was, I think still it's probably one of the best read stories I ever wrote for The Guardian. You know, it's this kind of fascinating tale of the most extraordinary kind of family secret. And so that was my first interest in it. And I started to think, okay, well, what's the history of this program? Where does it come from? And going back and finding this thread that tells you very interesting things about Russian history along the way, and also is full of interesting personal stories. And obviously it was, you know, it's not an easy topic to research. The KGB archives are very firmly closed, and even the Directorate S, which was the part of the KGB that ran illegals, even in the early 90s, where some of the KGB files for a brief period were opened to some researchers, the illegals files mostly stayed completely closed. But there were some places to look. So one of the biggest sort of paper sources for the book was an archive called the Mitrokhin Archive, which is right now it's in Cambridge in the UK, and it's this really extraordinary story of a KGB archivist who was in charge of moving the whole of the foreign intelligence archive from one place to another in Moscow in the late 70s, early 80s. And for 6 years, he copied as much as he could of every file while he was cataloging them, and then kind of hid the notes in his shoes, took them out of the archive, buried them under the floor in his dacha. And it's such an extraordinary story. And he retired from the KGB in 1984. He did nothing with these files for 6 years. And then when the Soviet Union started collapsing, he traveled to Lithuania. And he went to the US embassy and said, you know, I've got the copy of the entire KGB archive. And the local CIA person said, you know, you look like a mad old man. No, thank you. And then he went to the British embassy, and a young diplomat who was there sort of thought, well, you know, you look like a mad old man, but maybe there's actually
Let's have a look.
Something here. So I told him to come back when, you know, some people could fly in from London. So he came back a month later. Eventually, MI6 kind of got his archive out of Russia. He resettled in the UK. And since 2014, those files have been available to researchers to go and read. And the hundreds of thousands of pages are about illegals. So that was one source.
And then you speak to a person who has not told his story to anyone except briefly to his wife.
Yeah.
How did you manage to convince him that this was a good idea?
Yeah, well, that one was tricky, yeah. I mean, tracking down these people was hard. In that case, that was the son of an illegal whose parents were both illegals, and when he was 16, they told him that they wanted to train him to be a second-generation illegal. And he actually went to Moscow in the late 70s when he was 17, 18, and underwent this crazy spy training And then, probably luckily for him, the FBI caught the family a few years later, and they did a deal that they would sort of be resettled if they told the FBI everything. So he went into witness protection with a new identity. And yeah, I managed to track him down, and at this point, I had tried with a few illegals who had emigrated or were in the West, and they'd all said no. So I wrote him a letter, and I just sort of said, I'd like to meet. And initially, he said, absolutely not. I don't want to tell my story, but I'm interested in your project, so we could meet for a coffee. And then it was just a sort of process of making him comfortable. And in the end, I think he felt like it was a good, it was almost like getting the stuff off his chest. It was like a way to talk about it.
I guess.
But with a lot of these stories, both the recent ones where I could meet some of the operatives and the earlier ones from the archives, I guess the benefit of writing a book that covers 100 years is that, every single one of the characters in this book, I think, deserves their own biography. But often you have a situation where I can tell the story. So, for example, there's a character, Dmitry Bistrolyotov, who was active in London, where he was pretending to be a Hungarian count in the late 1920s, early 1930s.
Without knowing Hungarian.
Without knowing Hungarian, yeah.
Which I thought was a great detail.
Yes, yeah, he was very careful to try, hopefully not bump into any real Hungarians. And so he was somebody who had this amazing career. He did all kinds of things, and he wrote these memoirs, which are, absolutely full of made-up stuff, right? Some of it's true, but some of it's not. And how do you check that? So for him, to write a whole biography of him would be impossible. But there is one operation he did in London where he recruits a guy in the British Foreign Office. He kind of basically persuades him to hand over kind of suitcases full of documents. During the process, he ends up sleeping with the guy's wife. I mean, it's this whole chaotic story. But because MI5 in London realized that something was going on with this guy in the Foreign Office, and they started following him, they put a tap on his phone. There were all of these British documents from the time, so you could go and compare the memoir with those. So, I could tell that story and then kind of gloss over the next 4 years where you don't have the documentary basis to actually sort of, check what the guy's doing. And it's the same thing when you get to, closer to the present day. So the couple I spoke about who were in Boston with the two kids, so I met the mother, whose real name is Yelena Vavilova. Her cover name was Anne Foley. And, she's still in Moscow. She's sort of pro-Kremlin. She appears on talk shows. So she was never going to say to me, this is what, these were the spy tasks I had to do. But she was happy to talk about the psychological side of it, what it was like to, never speak Russian, how she felt about, lying to their kids for so long. And then the spy side of it, I could get at because the FBI had actually been onto them for many years and had been following them. And so there's a whole bunch of FBI files about what they were doing. So it was often a case of sort of trying to grab things from different angles and put them together to make a whole.
Well, I want to hear more about this human side to this very particular existence as an illegal. But we have to go back in time a little bit first, to the beginning, maybe. So this illegal program somehow starts with the Russian Revolution. Am I right? Or
I mean, even before that, which was what was interesting for me. Kind of I set off on this journey starting in 2010 and was kind of going back and back and back and finding that it goes back and back. So the kind of origins of it are actually in the kind of underground Bolshevik party before the Russian Revolution. So, Lenin and the other Bolsheviks, they were a conspiratorial underground party. They were, they had, when the sort of Tsarist system allowed opportunities, they would have what they called legal operatives who would work under their own name, who would be elected to the parliament, who would do trade union work. And then they had this underground side of the party, which they called the illegals, who were people who would live in disguise, they would do secret stuff, they would work clandestinely. And of course, they come to power in October 1917, and they have this huge country to rule. and they basically paste their underground party structure onto their first intelligence service. So, you know, the early, it wasn't even the Soviet Union yet, but from 1922, the Soviet Union, they're this quite fragile state in a hostile world surrounded by countries who want to topple the Soviet government. They don't have embassies in most countries, so they can't send these diplomats as spies. They can't even send diplomats. But they do have all of these sort of well-traveled, cosmopolitan, passionate communists who have the background in the underground, who are used to being in disguise, who are used to posing. Often they speak many languages. So these become the first illegals. They're people for whom sort of being in disguise is almost a way of life. And, you know, then what happens is that many of these people are actually executed by their own side in 1937, 1938, when the purges happen under Stalin. And when the Cold War starts in the late 1940s, the Russian intelligence bodies think, well, you know, we had this great system, we had these illegals, they were, you know, the pride of our service, like we should you know, resurrect this program. But they don't have anymore this kind of well-traveled communists who speak many languages because they've all been killed. And, you know, indeed, having lived abroad or speaking multiple languages is now an object of suspicion. So what they start to do is create this program which, you know, more or less lasts to the present day, which is something a bit different. It's, you know, going around the universities in the Soviet Union, finding very talented, brilliant, linguistically apt 19, 20-year-old students, and then recruiting them into this like very long and intensive training program where they basically learn to become a foreigner.
And to go a bit back before the Second World War and before the purges, these were the illegals that actually, I mean, first of all, because it was probably easier to have a fake identity. It was easier to fake a passport, and you had access to these people who, as you say, knew the languages, and they had already maybe posed as a different person. There's a point in your book where someone just enters into the Greek embassy and tells a very touching story about how he is actually from Greece, but unfortunately never got to learn the language, and it ends up with him getting a Greek passport.
Yep.
That doesn't happen so often these days.
It's a bit harder now,
I suppose. But then, what I think is interesting too, which is somehow a bit of a paradox of this whole program, is that sometimes they got intelligence that was excellent. Like just before the Second World War, you're describing how Stalin's agents, his illegals, knew about the German invasion, and they provided him with all kinds of intelligence, and he just didn't believe it, which seems a bit of a problem for a system that is so conspiratorial from its birth, that you have to not only get this information, but you have to also believe your own agents. That's a thread in the book, isn't it? That they're not always credible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of something that comes out with intelligence work anywhere. That, you know, it's one thing collecting the information, and it's another thing analyzing and understanding the information. And, you know, I think in all systems, including in, you know, Western European systems, and certainly now in the US, there can be, you know, people can be worried about, should I send, you know, does this information fit with what the political elite want to hear? Should we kind of maybe polish this a bit so it doesn't seem too problematic? And of course, in the Soviet system, where, you know, the world is, on the one hand, you know, the world is meant to develop according to the laws of, you know, Marxism, Leninism. So if your analysis suggests that it's going to develop in a different way, you have a problem. And also in the Stalin period, obviously you have this paranoid leader who's, you know, weirdly sees these plots everywhere and is convinced that, you know, in the same way that the Soviet Union has illegals in the West must have these illegals inside the Soviet Union, and he wants to root them out and execute them. So he's super paranoid, but then he misses, you know, the biggest, most obvious plot of all, which is that Hitler is kind of about to start a war on the second front with Russia, and he just misses a lot of intelligence about that. yeah, so that is a problem. I think that's probably the most glaring example of that, and it has a sort of a faint echo, I think, in early 2022 when some people in the Russian intelligence services certainly knew that it wasn't going to be super easy to walk into Ukraine and take Kyiv in 3 days. Particularly the Foreign Intelligence Service knew that, but felt unable to properly get that across to Putin because he'd taken the decision, and your job is to sort of go along with it rather than inform it, really. So yeah, that is, I think it's a theme everywhere with intelligence, but particularly the kind of political system in Russia, it becomes a real problem for them at times.
And you mentioned Stalin's fear of Western illegals, but there haven't been that many. This is not a thing that the West has done very much, or as far as we know.
Yeah, so no, as far as we know, no. I mean, I had some conversations recently with some former CIA people who said that, so for example, the CIA has on occasion, if they have, I'm just going to use this as a fake example, but if they have a French-American dual national, they might quietly remove the American part of the story and use this person as a French national traveling the world, because then as this sort of deep knock, a non-official cover operative, because it's more helpful for them to have no links to the US. But that's a very different thing to, finding someone in Iowa and putting them in a house and training them to become a French person for years on end. They don't really do that. The one place that I think uses a similar kind of operative, although again, it's not about spending years training them, that's Israel and the Israeli intelligence services. And when you think about it, it's quite logical because they have a very similar, in many ways, situation to the early Soviet Union, in that it's a country where there are kind of people from all over the world who come there. So there are, Latin American Jews and Jews from the Arab world and Jews from Germany and so on. So you can very easily just remove the Jewish part of the biography and send this person abroad as that nationality. And of course, it's also a country that's surrounded by hostile powers. So I think the Israeli services do use this, but in general, it's as Vladimir Putin likes to remind everyone very often, because it's now become almost this cult of the illegal in Russia. This is something that really only happens in Russia in this way of kind of training these people from scratch to turn them into foreigners.
And during the Cold War, then it became, or one could see it as necessary to have this program, because as you write at a certain point in your book, this was a situation, a time where no one from the Soviet Union could move around freely in the West, not even the diplomats, also because they kept to themselves and they were living in somehow Soviet realities, even if they were in the States. And then you had, 100 illegal people of a population of, several...
240 million.
240 million. Out of 240 million, you have 100 people who move around unnoticed in the West. It's quite a remarkable way of living your life compared to the rest of the people in the Soviet Union. What kind of intelligence did they get, these people? They were pretending to be Westerners, and they were trying to send stuff back. It wasn't always very easy.
No, and so I think, my feeling was that with every decade that this program goes on, it becomes harder and harder to become an illegal. I mean, it becomes harder to pass off. Document checks get better during the Cold War. The FBI suddenly appears. So if you're working in the US, there's a much harsher counterintelligence environment. There are databases that start to appear, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes much harder to do. And at the same time, this kind of thing that you had of the, the Hungarian count turning into a Dutch painter, turning into an English lord, like from one week to the next.
Norwegian herring salesman.
Norwegian herring salesman.
There was a guy.
Point, yeah.
This is true. There is a person posing as a herring salesman. Yeah.
So you can't do that anymore. They're training these people. They're giving them one identity. This is a mission that's meant to last for years and years. So they naturally also get more cautious, because if you've just trained somebody for 5 years and then you send them abroad and you say, go and recruit this person, we think he might want to work for us, and they do that and the person doesn't want to work for them, then the illegal is burned forever. All that training is pointless. So they become quite risk averse. There's also, of course, a sense, this is the Cold War. There's a worry that at any time it could turn into a hot war, and diplomatic relations will be cut. There will be no embassies, and then suddenly they will have, the idea is that they'll have these kind of sleeper cells which they'll be able to activate in the West. So that's one part of the reason why they get less active. And what they end up doing, with some exceptions, there are still people who do some quite interesting things, but for me, as the years go on, it becomes less a story about amazing kind of espionage successes and more a story about the psychological side of this and what it's like to kind of inhabit a new identity. But yeah, they tend to send back some quite banal stuff. They're meant to write political reports on what it's like, and if they're in the US, the US or whatever their country is. They write personality profiles of interesting people they meet. So they would never actually try to recruit that person. But if they met, say, a university professor, and they thought that either he was very left-wing, so he could be like amenable to being recruited, or all the classic things, he had home issues, marriage problems, money problems, etc., etc. They would send a report, and then another operative could be sent to try to recruit that person, and then would send this stuff, which just going back to your point about the 100 people out of 240 million. I mean, this was a kind of realization I had in the middle of this research, that I think on the face of it, this is pretty ridiculous, right? You're training somebody for all of these years, you're giving them this elite training. It takes hundreds, thousands of hours of time of different trainers, all kinds of things to get them ready to go abroad. And then in one case in the late 1970s, you have a guy, and he shows up in New York, and he's working as a bicycle delivery boy, sending packages to different people's houses. And they say to him, well, we want you to penetrate like decision-making circles in the US. And he's like, well, I've got an amazing degree from an East German university, but I don't have any educational qualifications in my fake identity. How do you expect me to get close to politicians? And he does this menial job. And you think, honestly, this is absurd. And then I had this kind of counterintuitive thought that okay, this is the peak of the Cold War. The two sides really misunderstand each other, like two big nuclear powers. And these reports that the illegals were sending back, this insight that you're getting as a bicycle delivery boy in New York, it maybe seems ridiculous, but it was actually very different to anything else that the Soviet system was getting, because the diplomats were sitting in the embassy, the KGB guys were watching the diplomats, they were watching their own KGB people, they lived in these compounds, they watched Soviet films, they had party meetings, they didn't really understand US society at all. And then you had these people who were allowed, they weren't, by definition, they couldn't have contact with this Soviet world. They were allowed to move around freely, they could talk to people, they could gauge the mood of people. And they sent back these reports, and we know from Mitrokhin files and memoirs and things that Andropov, who was the long-term chairman of the KGB, he read all of these reports that illegals sent back, and this was kind of the closest thing he got to understanding, so who knows whether it ever helped with anything, but when you put it in the context of a nuclear standoff, and suddenly you think, well, how much does one nuclear missile cost, and how much would it cost if there was actually a massive war, suddenly this ridiculous cost of training an illegal pales in comparison. Obviously, if you were an open society and you allowed people to travel freely, and people could go, and you wouldn't need to train an illegal to go and be a bicycle delivery boy. But in the context of this Soviet system, I suddenly realized maybe they weren't as useless as they seemed, even though they were doing kind of apparently useless things.
Yeah, they were the only ones who saw how these societies actually were. And when they saw that, it wasn't always easy to be convinced that the society that had sent them was the best one.
Yes, it wasn't, and there are plenty of cases of illegals defecting, or illegals going a bit mad, or illegals, going off the rails. But a lot of them did stay loyal, and I think part of the reason for that is that actually, what was interesting is that when you're an illegal, so you're plucked out of university when you're 18, 19, you do this intensive training program. And then you're put in, during this program, you're in safe houses, and then when you're sort of 23, 24, you get deployed abroad. And after that, you only really come back for these very short visits to the Soviet Union, and once every few years, because, for security reasons, you have to go a circuitous route, swap passports, all this kind of stuff. So they do it quite rarely. So what happened was you would have these people who would be posted in, say, the US, and they would see all of the very obvious flaws of the US. I mean, many of them might find things they liked about it, but of course these were far from perfect societies. So they would see all of this, but they wouldn't actually see the flaws of the Soviet Union because they didn't live in the Soviet Union. They had this very kind of patriotic training. They were, usually had very strong, kind of Marxist, pro-Soviet indoctrination. And then they would go abroad and they would only have very fleeting interactions with the Soviet Union, to the point that, coming back to the present day, I mean, when Yelena, the mother of these two boys that I started talking about from Boston, so they were deployed in 1987, they came back in 2010. And she said it was kind of crazy because they come back and they realized they'd missed, they didn't know who any of the famous singers were, they didn't know any famous actors, they'd missed these decades of kind of cultural and just society, they'd missed the change, they'd left this kind of Soviet Union, and they arrived in this brash capitalist Moscow full of adverts and bars and restaurants. And so you have this weird thing where you're fiercely loyal to your country, but you don't actually know anything about it.
It is a particular type of loyalty. I want to stick a little bit with the romantic side of this, or the not romantic in the sense of falling in love, because that's another thing.
We can do either. Yeah.
We can do either. No, we have to do that first, because you were talking about this training. So you pick a young person, he or she gets training, but what several of them also have to do is that the system has to find them a wife or a spouse, because it's better to be a couple when you're posing as someone who lives abroad and someone who has a life there. And there is a whole elaborate system for one of the persons that you're talking about, how the party or the KGB tries to find a suitable spy wife. It's quite a particular way of doing this.
It's fascinating, I think, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow when I do a talk in more detail, but the kind of basics of... So basically what happened is when they started with the Cold War spies, right, when they moved from this kind of system what we talked about in the 20s and 30s to this longer-term infiltrations into the US, the first, and at this stage, almost everyone they recruited was male, because the KGB assumed that, spying was a man's job. So they train all of these men, and they go abroad to the US, and what happens with a lot of them is they can't handle the pressure, because they have no contact with... Often they have a wife who's at home, family who stays behind, and they go and they have nobody to talk to, nobody to confide in. And there's a couple of cases early on. I mean, there's a guy who defects. There's another guy who goes to Canada, and he's meant to be posing as a Canadian, so they send him for a few. The idea is he goes for a few months to Canada to sort of perfect his story of the places he supposedly grew up, and then he'll go to the US. But pretty soon after he's arrived in Canada, he ends up sleeping with I think the daughter of the landlady of the guest house he's staying in. and basically tells her everything. So it's like, says, by the way, I'm a Soviet illegal. It's really good to have someone to talk to.
It is a pretty good pickup story for I don't know if you know who I am.
Yeah.
Fairly interesting.
She's, of course, horrified and says, well, you've got to go to the authorities and tell them about this. So he does that. And, to cut a long story short, the Canadian authorities move the woman to another city in Canada, recruit this guy, get him to work as a double agent, send him back to Moscow to get information, but they realize he's been turned and he ends up spending 30 years in prison in Russia. So, they start to think maybe it's not the best thing to send these people out there on their own. So, indeed, they start to have this... the idea that if you send a pair abroad as a couple, they will be, they'll both, first of all, they'll be able to support each other. Second of all, if one of them starts losing it, the other one can kind of drag them back to the Soviet Union before they defect or, have a breakdown. And that happens on a number of occasions. And I mean, this is still the idea is still... In the KGB's head, the idea is that the male, the husband, will be the sort of main illegal, and the wife will, transcribe the messages, do the communications with the center, and that's something that kind of stays actually until the present day. And when I was talking to the FBI people who were listening in to this, again going back to this couple in Boston that I was talking about at the beginning, they said, we were listening to these two guys, we were listening to their phone calls, we were listening to their home conversations, and any competent service would have switched their roles because it was obvious that she was way better at the job than he was, but they didn't do that because that just wasn't part of the kind of culture at that moment.
Luckily, that only happens in Russian societies.
Yes. But you end up with this situation of sending the couples abroad, and in some cases it works, shockingly. In other cases it doesn't work. I think there is sometimes there's a perception that this works just by literally Oleg meets Svetlana, this is your wife for the rest of your life. As they didn't quite do it like that. The idea was that they gave some options, or you were supposed to suggest, is there anyone that you knew that you think was, anyone who's sort of good at languages and politically reliable and might be suitable for this work, and then the KGB would go and sort of do their investigations. But there's some amazing documents. I mean, one of the places I didn't mention that I used for the book was the files in Kiev, because most of the illegals' files are in Moscow and they're closed, but some of the illegals were trained in Kiev. So Ukrainian intelligence gave me a whole bunch of these training files. And you have these amazing, when they're looking for wives for these people being trained, you have these missives that they send out to different KGB offices in Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine. And, they say, they don't say it's for an illegal because it's sort of too secret but they say, for work abroad, we are looking, please let us know if you have any suitable candidates. And the criteria are, they should be between 20 and 24. They should be pleasant to look at, but not too good looking, because, you don't want somebody who's going to attract attention in a crowd. There's some height requirements. They don't want someone who's very short or very tall, again, because you're supposed to blend in. And you should be good at languages, and very importantly, you should be what they would say politically reliable. So there should be no dissidents in your family or things like this.
Can we just talk a little bit about one of the success stories, one of my favorite characters in the book? I think if you can handle one more story, there are an amazing amount of stories. But this is a man who calls himself Teodoro Castro. And he manages to become the ambassador for Costa Rica in Rome. But actually his name is Josip Griglevich. And how on earth did he manage to pull off that?
Yeah, I mean, he's an amazing character that I really hope somebody writes a really good biography of one day. There's a Costa Rican writer who's written a short biography of him. But one of the most amazing illegals, and probably the last one in that mold of those kind of early adventurers who does crazy stuff.
And he even says himself that those were romantic times. We were the romantic spies.
Yeah,
he has a. Sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, his life story. He's born in Lithuania. He's in the underground. He gets recruited during the Spanish Civil War. There's this kind of early story with him where he's actually he leads the first group that tries to assassinate Trotsky in Mexico City, and he fails before the next group actually succeeds. And then he comes back to Moscow after this years in South America in 1948, and he's charmed the Costa Rican consul in Chile, and he said to him, he spun this whole story that he's the illegitimate son of a Costa Rican landowner, and he was forced to flee when he was a child, but now he wants to get back in touch with his roots. And this guy is so charmed by this story, he gives him a Costa Rican passport. So he goes back to Moscow and says, I've got this solid passport. And they say, well, we want you to go to Italy. It's 1948-9. It's the early Cold War. It's one of the key battlegrounds between sort of West and Soviet Union. And he shows up in Rome as a Costa Rican and sets up Costa Rican business, basically. He meets all of the other Latin American diplomats and business people in the city, and he gets so well connected, partly because he's also got a very handy flow of money coming from Moscow to sort of prove his business creds, that when the Prime Minister of Costa Rica comes and visits, and by this point he's so well connected, he gets the Prime Minister a meeting with the Pope. The Prime Minister's so happy that eventually they were like, well, we should make this guy our ambassador in Rome because we don't have one. Currently we're running the embassy from Spain. So Teodoro Castro, who has never in his life set foot in Costa Rica, becomes the Costa Rican ambassador to Rome. And he has this extraordinary contact list. He's having tea with the American ambassador. He's meeting the Pope once a week. He gets accredited also to be ambassador to Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia at this time, it's a communist country, but it's Tito, the leader, has fallen out with Stalin. Stalin is furious that Yugoslavia thinks it can kind of run its own type of communism separate to the Soviet type. And they come up with this plan that Teodoro Castro, the ambassador of Costa Rica, is going to assassinate Tito. And they draw up 4 options, and they're all completely ridiculous. But one of them is a poisoned box of chocolates. Another one is that he's going to come and he's going to release powdered plague into the air, and he will have been pre-vaccinated against plague, and everyone else will get plague. Poor Teodoro Castro, who's been quite enjoying his life on the cocktail circuit in Rome, suddenly finds he's got to go on what sounds like a suicide mission. And very luckily for him, and he gets a meeting with Tito to hand in his credentials, which is set for April 1953. And this is probably when this would have happened. And then a few weeks before, Stalin dies. And the mission is called off. And there's then this crazy coda to his story so he goes back to Moscow in 1954, and for the next 3 decades, he works as an academic writing about Latin America, and he writes about 20 books on Latin America. None of his colleagues know that he had this other life, and even one of his books is a biography of the Mexican artist David Siqueiros, and it doesn't say in this biography that the author and the subject together tried to assassinate Trotsky. In fact, so just really an extraordinary character. And he dies in 1988, just before the Soviet Union collapses, and all of this comes out only after the collapse in the 90s, and that's when the Costa Ricans finally found out what happened to their ambassador, who disappeared from Rome in 1953.
No, he needs a biography. I also like him because one of the places where he dropped off secret messages was when I was reading the book. It's just 100 meters from where I used to live in Rome, so the whole area got a new exciting touch. But so this is funny, and it's a bit quaint, and it's a bit ridiculous, some of this. some of the stories, I mean, and then it's also extremely serious and sinister, or at least if we take this to our time, there is one person who is quite invested in the idea of illegals, and that is Vladimir Putin. He has, on several occasions, boosted the illegals program again, and was wondering first, could you tell us something about Putin's connections to this? I mean, his background as a KGB officer is always mentioned, but often quite quickly, a bit like a historical, funny detail. But it says quite a lot about who he is my guess.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, so, you know, there's two schools of thought about whether Putin in the KGB was a kind of bit of a random cog who didn't really do anything important in Dresden in East Germany, which was obviously not a prestigious place to be. And then people who think actually he was running some quite serious operations there. I'm slightly inclined more to the former, but what is clear is that he did do quite a bit of work with illegals, and he was one of his first tasks when he went to East Germany was doing this very early stage of illegal selection, so identifying people who might have the characteristics to make a good illegal. And that seems to have stayed with him. So, you know, he's given a number of speeches where he's kind of talked about how proud he is of illegals, and the whole idea of kind of sacrificing your life, essentially, to live in another person's identity and all, you know, in the name of the motherland. Like, this fits very nicely into Putin's myth that, you know, Russia is a special place. We're not like the West. We are, you know, we have these great operatives who are like martyring everything. And so what you have now, you know, in the Soviet period, you would often have illegals who would do amazing things, and then they would come back and there would be suspicion of them, that maybe they'd been turned while they were abroad. They would often have quite miserable afterlives. Now you have the opposite thing. So someone like Andrei and Yelena, the Boston couple, for 10 years they were followed by the FBI. So basically, despite the fact that they were, you know, lying to their own kids every day, all of their espionage work was worthless because they were the Americans knew what they were doing. Yeah. But they come back to Russia and they're kind of feted as heroes. They appear on these chat shows as, you know, please welcome the legendary spies like Andrei Bezrukov and Yelena Vavilova. So there's this kind of cult which is cultivated, and, you know, every few weeks there's a new documentary on TV about illegals which, you know, cuts out all of the unpleasant psychological side, cuts out the fact that many of them actually didn't do that much, and really portrays them as this kind of extraordinary thing, which of course in one sense is right, because as we said, I mean, they are different, they are uniquely Russian, and there isn't anyone who does something quite like it. But yeah, it's become kind of something that is it's sort of a self-perpetuating thing, because it's become their sort of calling card a bit.
So it's still there, and he still spends money on it. But if we're going to characterize Russia's spy operations today, they seem to be more about disposable agents than illegal long-term agents. Or recruiting people to do small operations.
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, I think one thing that's been really interesting. So because you've had, first of all, after Crimea, and then after the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in 2018, and then after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you've had these several rounds where Russian diplomats, which normally means, you know, Russian spies, the Russian legal officers working in the embassies, have been expelled from many European capitals. I think it's 400 or 500 who've been expelled in recent years. So that's dramatically lessened the capabilities that Russia has to spy using these legals. So they've kind of turned to both ends of the spectrum to make up for this. So on the one hand, that's actually using the illegals more, using the ones that they've had, and maybe making them do slightly riskier things that they wouldn't have liked to get them to do before. They would have got someone in the embassy to do it. And that's part of the reason, I think, why in the last 3 years we've actually seen 9 or 10 illegals be arrested in different countries, one of them in Norway. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have, on the one hand, you have these long-term, expensive super agents, the illegals, And then indeed on the other extreme, they've started this kind of recruitment of one-time disposable operatives. So for example, in Poland, this is happening a lot, where there'll be messages in Telegram groups which are read by, Russian speakers, usually not Russians because there aren't many Russian citizens in Poland, but it'll be Belarusians or Ukrainian refugees. Some of them will kind of realize that this is a bit of a sketchy task, it must be Russia. Some of them won't realize. And basically you'll be offered a bit of cryptocurrency or a bit of cash to, move a package from this place and put it next to a railway line, or go and set a shop on fire. And there's this, so there's, and it's really, some of this stuff is really scary. In Ukraine, which seems to be a kind of testing ground for what Russia might do later in Europe, that's where the sort of arson and this sabotage stuff started. One of the stories I was working on recently was essentially turning teenagers into unwitting suicide bombers. So they would recruit one person, send them a video of how to make a very crude bomb, send them a couple of $100. That person would leave the package, in this case it was in a car garage, and then they would send another 2 kids and say, we have a task for you, go and pick up this package, it's full of paint, take it to the police station, and when you're there, open it and spray some paint, and it will be a political message, and we'll pay you $1,000. And then they get there, and the person remotely detonates this bomb, killing the police officers and the guy who's holding it. So, and of course, the advantage of this for the Russians is, when an illegal gets arrested, as we saw in Norway, in Slovenia, in Poland in recent years, they then have to try and arrange an exchange, try and get them out of prison, get them back to Russia. When these people recruited on Telegram who are arrested, they just wash their hands of it and recruit someone else. So it's kind of, the middle part, the spies in the embassy have been decimated, so they're kind of going both sides of that.
Mm. And today it was published, the report from the Norwegian intelligence services, and when they went through the different credible threats, recruiting of Russian-speaking refugees Ukrainian refugees or other people living in Norway for these types of operations, for that kind of sabotage work was mentioned among the things that is now a clear and present danger to Norwegian security.
Yeah, and of course it doesn't have to be Russian speakers as well. In Britain and in Netherlands, they've also recruited locals. It's it almost creates more of it's more similar to the counter-terrorism threat in the way that you have to deal with it, and it also brings up all of the same questions about privacy and about because it's not easy to find for the services to find out who's clicking on some random Telegram group offering $200 to move a parcel from A to B. So how do you find those people without kind of mass surveilling everybody? It's a kind of tricky and a dilemma which I think is going to get more and more acute.
Mm-hmm. Could you just remind the audience about the illegal who was arrested in Norway? What the story was there?
Yeah, so this was a guy. His real name was Mikhail Mikushin. I think he was posing as a Brazilian researcher, José Giamaria, I think, something like that. And what's interesting, so he was unlike many of the illegals I write about who worked for the KGB and in the modern day the SVR, which is the kind of successor. He was one of a number of illegals who have been arrested recently who worked for the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. And what has been interesting about these is they all seem to be, they all did pop. These were not bicycle delivery couriers. They popped up in very interesting places. So, you had a Peruvian woman who was based in Naples and was hanging out with some of the NATO naval officers in Naples. You had a guy who was arrested in the Netherlands who was just about to take up, also posing as a Brazilian, just about to take up an internship at the International Criminal Court, just as the ICC was, reviewing its charges against Putin. And then the guy I think he was at the University of Tromsø, and he popped up in these. There's some amazing pictures of him taking part in like panels on how to combat Russian hybrid warfare, and there is like Mr. Mikhail Mikushin sitting in as the Brazilian researcher. So that's a kind of sign that some of them are a bit more sloppy when you look at the way that their kind of what they call their legends have been created. They don't take as many years of training and care as the KGB, the SVR do, but they somehow end up in kind of quite disturbing places.
The last issue that we will have time to discuss it's what you call virtual illegals. So the part of the troll factories, but also this idea of creating online identities that somehow move from observing and spying to influencing. How do you see this in relation to this whole century-old tradition, the whole idea of changing the way Westerners think through influencing them on social media or through online presence?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's like two separate things there. So kind of disinformation and influence operations have always been one part of what the KGB did, and I guess the illegals tended to be separate to that. What I found interesting was this idea that it's now, whereas if in the 1950s it would take you years to create a solid US identity, which was believable, now you can create one in 5 minutes on Facebook. And that's what the Russians were doing, when in this very well-covered kind of interference in the US elections in 2016. So you had this extraordinary situation where someone in St. Petersburg was creating an American Facebook account and messaging other political organizers saying, we are supporting the Trump rally, we want to help you with, and we'll meet you there on the day, and sending the money, doing all the organizational stuff, and then on the day saying, sorry, we can't make it. But actually, this person sitting in St. Petersburg is managing to create a political rally in the US, posing as an American. And again, rather like these disposable operatives, whereas an illegal could never risk doing that because, if they get busted, that's it. If this Facebook identity gets busted, then you close it down and you create another one in 5 minutes. So to me, it was kind of interesting the way that the sort of concepts of the illegal, of creating this like convincing Westerner, have been updated for the modern age.
On a scale from 1 to 10, how probable is it that Donald Trump is an illegal agent?
Well, we almost managed to do the whole panel without talking about Trump. I mean, I think that the most depressing answer I've heard to this is sort of, does it really matter? Because, I mean, he's so open about it. I mean, I think if he was, he would be more careful not to look like one all the time. Right?
All right. I think that's a pretty... Well, I don't know if it's a good place to end, but it is certainly a place to end, and we'll see where all of this happens. Make sure, if you have time, to hear Shaun's speech tomorrow, where he will be talking a little bit more about these personal and dilemmas involved with the people and families of illegals. Tomorrow at 2:15, was it?
3, I think.
At 3.
3 o'clock.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this, and thank you all for coming. Thanks.